Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in neuroscience, where I focused on mapping out part of the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety. And so I hope you're all staying, reasonably safe and reasonably sane. So this week I wanted to talk about a story that came out of the artificial intelligence company called DeepMind, which was acquired by Google years ago. And its relevance may be like a little bit arcane, but believe me when I say that this is a pretty big deal. Now, you may be unfamiliar with the name of that company, but you may actually be familiar with some of their achievements several years ago. Probably the most prominent was the success of one of their artificial intelligence efforts named AlphaGo. And here's a poster from the documentary that was filmed to track the development of this endeavor to make an artificial intelligence or a form of it. And so I talked about this some months or years ago, particularly because the founder of the company, DeepMind, gave a keynote address at the Society for Neuroscience conference that I attended several years ago. His name is Demis Hassabis, or Sabis. And he basically described the strategy that they applied to develop a series of artificial intelligences, ultimately resulting in one named AlphaGo. And so the company was founded in 2010 in London. And at the time, during his talk in 2017, over 600 people comprised the company, with the vast majority being research scientists. And the fundamental mission of this company was twofold. First, solve intelligence. They wanted to figure out how natural intelligence works, and then recreate it artificially. And then second, solve everything else. So I don't know if he actually used those specific words, solve everything else, but those were just the words that I put in my notes during his talk. It wouldn't surprise me if he did, but it just seems like just what they've been pursuing, right? And there's a great example of that recently, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And so, as I said earlier, the first achievement of this company, about which you might have heard, involved designing an artificial intelligence that would be capable of beating humans at the game Go. And that achievement was considered to be like a holy grail of the endeavor of creating an artificial intelligence. So Go is a board game that was invented in China over 2,500 years ago, and it's an incredibly complicated game, compared to chess. Both the size of the board and the number of possible moves one can make at any given point is significantly greater than the equivalent in chess. And so fundamentally the game is pretty similar, with like white and black pieces for each of two players, or light and dark pieces. But the ultimate goal in Go is to surround your opponent's pieces, or like wall them off against a side of the board, rather than try and take like a specific piece, right, like the king in chess. And so according to Hassabis' talk, the average number of possible moves a Go player can make is 200. At any given point on the board, and this is an order of magnitude greater than a chess player would confront. And so due largely to this like higher level of complexity, it was long thought to be impossible to make a move evaluating algorithm that a program could use to assess the progress of a game, assess who's winning, and identify optimal moves. And so evidently when Go grandmasters are interviewed, the strategies that they employ are sort of like fundamentally different relative to like chess grandmasters. So the Go players don't basically calculate every single move or opportunity as chess players oftentimes do. They're driven by something like intuition. And so according to Hassabis, grandmasters will often say, Go grandmasters will often say that they play a given move because it felt right. And so because of these fairly intangible and like less quantifiable aspects of Go, it was sort of like this artificial intelligence holy grail after what was achieved with computer programs since the 1980s, with the most famous victory in chess being accomplished by Deep Blue, beating world chess champion Garry Kasparov in 1997. And so and you can see that there. You can see Garry Kasparov on this side struggling. And so anyways, back to AlphaGo. So the reason we're aware of this story is that AlphaGo, again, DeepMind's most prominent, or as a little while ago, last most prominent artificial intelligence achievement, turned out to defeat the world Go champion at the time named Lee Sedol. And so you can see that right on the movie poster. And so Sedol is clearly a brilliant guy and incredibly humble and charming, given how dominant he is in this incredibly complicated game. He'd won 18 world titles and was considered the best player of the last decade. And so AlphaGo ended up winning 4 matches out of 5. So Lee Sedol won a match against this program. Of course, Demis Hassabis, the founder of DeepMind, said he was disappointed that AlphaGo lost that match. But I think it's actually pretty impressive that Lee Sedol was able to beat the program, just given the way it was devised. And there were some pretty specific moments in these matches that stand out as like emblematic of what was different about how AlphaGo played the game relative to human players. And once again, I'll recommend checking out the documentary because they do a good job of like getting into these specific moments that are instructive during the match. And so I don't want to go into like significant depth regarding how they crafted AlphaGo, but like the heart of this artificial intelligence's brain, using that term loosely, of course, was basically a combination of 2 fundamental components, or as they call them, networks. So they had a policy network and a value network. The strategy is evidently somewhat common among machine learning and like Monte Carlo's methods to achieve something called reinforcement learning. And frankly, this reflects how one of the most important circuits in the human brain, the dopaminergic system, which is both near and dear to my heart, operates. So more of that on that in a second. So here's how they set up this artificial intelligence. The policy network was basically the product of 200 games of humans playing Go. And they use this database of Go matches, Go games, to basically train their artificial intelligence as to what the optimal moves would be in any given situation, just from all that experience, right? and because, of course, one player always wins and one loses in a Go match, right? And so, whatever moves the victors have made can be an indication of like superior strategies at any given moment, right? And then their value network, the other network, is where things get interesting. So while the policy network was the AI learning from hundreds of Go matches, the value network was the product of the AI playing against itself. And they had to play itself over and over and over and learn from what the optimal moves tended to be in any given circumstance by which version of the AI playing against itself tended to be. So they were basically like combining deep learning with reinforcement learning to create this AI that literally ended up being superhuman at playing Go. And so if you think about this like superficially, your reaction might be like, okay, cool, they made a computer program that was able to play this like esoteric board game, who cares? And that's technically true. But if you think about it a little bit more deeply, like about this architecture, the AI's policy and value networks, this AI is basically functioning like a human. So stick with me for a sec here. So their policy network is operating like a sensory system. It's observing events, it's watching these hundreds of Go matches, just like you almost certainly would, probably on YouTube, in fact, to see how it is that people play this game. If you weren't watching videos, perhaps you'd observe an actual person playing Go in front of you, right? Maybe your parents or your siblings, but you're still watching, right? It's just like how we learn how to hit a baseball with a baseball bat. People can provide you with instructions of how to hit a baseball, right? Grip the bat properly, hold the bat behind you in some specific way, line up your feet approximately shoulder width apart, elbow out, and then step towards the pitcher, turn your body to swing, follow through. You can get all of those instructions and never hit a baseball because it just doesn't all fit together. Same goes with like sinking, a basketball shot or throwing a perfect spiral with a football. Rely on our sensory systems to feed our higher order cognitive systems critical information about the environment and our interactions with the environment. Well, AlphaGo was doing exactly the same thing by watching hundreds of videos of Go matches. But then consider their value network, the other network. Just like when you're learning to hit a baseball, you don't hit a home run on your first try, right? You practice and you practice and practice, and more importantly, you learn from your errors. You have to try over and over, figure out what works, what doesn't, adjusting your execution accordingly. That's basically exactly what AlphaGo was doing by playing against itself. So you can hear my daughter in the background. She's very excited about artificial intelligence. So that's what AlphaGo is basically doing by playing itself over and over, learning what works and what doesn't work based on the sensory information that it had absorbed from watching all those videos. And so there are tons of examples of these kinds of relationships within the human brain and human consciousness, but I'd like to focus on the parallel between their value network and our dopaminergic system. And I'm going to do my best to not get overly technical, but if you take anything away from this part of the discussion, this is something that I think will give you an understanding of dopamine that's leaps and bounds beyond what the vast majority of people appreciate, including plenty of people in biomedical science and in medicine. So we have to start out with the basics of how the dopamine signaling system in the brain actually works. And so this is from a very famous study conducted by people in Switzerland at the time, Cambridge, and my former graduate institution, Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. And the senior author on this study, Reed Montague, is an incredibly brilliant and charming scientist who left Baylor College of Medicine right before I got there. But if you've ever heard of the neuroscientist David Eagleman, he trained in Reed Montague's lab, and I did get to meet Reed Montague. And this was all at BCM, right? The lead author, Wolfram Schultz, is now at Cambridge University. He was in Switzerland at the time, almost certainly because, the importance of this study has and the research that it's led to, got him to Cambridge. But at the time, it had been shown that dopamine levels seem to respond to exposure to rewarding stimuli, right? If I present you with $10 million, your dopamine levels will skyrocket, assuming that you're not a billionaire or whatever. So we had a sense of where those dopamine neurons lived, those dopamine neurons that would respond to your, new $10 million. And so, we knew that much. We had a general sense of these things, but what this study demonstrated, and the reason I bring it up as in the context of artificial intelligence, is that they refined our understanding of what exactly these dopamine levels do, what they actually correspond to. So you can see in that somewhat inscrutable graph thingy over there with some, there's some dot plots and some bars on top, right? And so if you look closely, you can see that there are more dots in some areas than others. And those bars on the top help to clarify which areas have more dots than other areas, right? And, this is a little simplistic, but basically more dots mean more activity from dopamine neurons, which therefore means more dopamine release. And so, you're basically seeing changes in dopamine levels over time. As you move sideways, horizontally along the x-axis, we're moving forward in time. And so, the left side of the plots are earlier in time, and as you move towards the right, you're moving forward in time. So here's what the experiment shows. First, the first time monkeys, this is an experiment with monkeys, were exposed to this experiment, they received some delicious juice, all of a sudden, randomly, unpredictably, marked by that R in the top plot up there. And so, they get their juice, and then you see that their dopamine neurons start cranking out a bit more dopamine, which you can see in the higher density of dots along with those higher bars on the top there. And they were surprised with a bit of juice, and their dopamine levels responded with some activity. So that's pretty cool. However, when a monkey was trained to expect a bit of juice, just like humans, monkeys love juice, right? It's like a rewarding stimulus. They see a light come on or they hear a specific sound, their dopamine neurons would start cranking out dopamine almost right after the light or the sound, and not when they receive the actual reward, the actual juice. And so you can see that in the middle plot there. They see a light or they hear sound, some stimulus, and they've learned that light or that sound is always followed by some delicious juice. And there's a bunch of dopaminergic activity, right? You can see that dopaminergic activity in that cluster of dots and that peak in the columns there, right? That comes before the R, before the reward. But more importantly, you can see that the density of these dots and the heights of these columns isn't particularly significant when they receive the actual reward. So in other words, the dopamine wasn't responding to the juice itself, to the reward itself. Rather, they were responding to, the light or the sound that they learned predicted that they were about to receive that reward. Okay, so here's the part of the study that makes it such an elegant and important study, the bottom panel. You can see where they shined a light or they played that sound, right? And that, the monkeys had associated, that light or that sound with the reward, with the juice, and you see that robust density of dopaminergic response. That density of dots, almost like a line. With that super high, peak in the column there. But the most important finding is what happens next. Once the monkeys realized that there wasn't any reward when they expected it, where it says no R, no reward, you can see those dopamine neurons just completely shut off, right? It's like radio silence in dopamine land. And importantly, even when you compare the dopaminergic activity to what was going on before the light or the sound or whatever, their dopamine baseline, let's say, it's unusually silent. It's that moment when we fail to receive a reward that we've expected to happen, that we've learned happens. That's at the heart of learning, growth, improvement, maturation. All these things emerge from that specific event in our dopamine neurons, or at least importantly from them, significantly from them. So the monkeys expected that they'd get a bit of juice after hearing a sound, seeing a light, something like that, because after all, they'd learned that they always get juice after that sound or that light. But when they're surprised by the absence of that juice, that they were wrong, they just, like you would be, they get upset. And so in other words, the monkeys were predicting this reward, but then detecting an error. And that emotional experience of that disappointment from failing to get a positive outcome from some work you put in, that's what we're talking about. You thought you'd get an A on a test, but you don't, or maybe you at least above, maybe you were hoping for something above a C, right? If you're me, you thought you'd practiced enough and to get your free throws, to sink your free throws, or get a hit, right? Nail a play, whatever. That disappointment that you feel when you fail is what we're talking about here. That error you made in predicting that you'd get those positive outcomes from all that preparation, that's central to how this circuit functions and central to how the AlphaGo system was devised. That error, you thinking that you'd succeed when you fail, at least for humans like us, is experienced emotionally. It feels bad, right? And so we do whatever we can, whatever we can think of, to eliminate the future occurrence of that bad feeling. And at least one neurobiological component of that negative emotional experience is demonstrated in that bottom panel of that figure. It's that absence of dopamine in that moment when you expected all that work to pay off, but you fail to get what you were expecting. It's that part of what prediction error. That's what prediction error feels like, and it's central to how our dopaminergic circuit functions. Both in guiding our decision making and our behavior, as well as our emotional experiences. Okay, so how is the dopaminergic system, related to AlphaGo and this more recent artificial intelligence story? Well, just like we learn from incoming information, from what we observe, from what we're taught, and so on, AlphaGo learned from watching. Which series of moves resulted in victory and which resulted in loss in all of those Go matches. A loss was weighted negatively, a victory was weighted positively, and just like a reward for us feels good, it's a positive experience. All this to say that the strategy that DeepMind used to develop this computer program, or artificial intelligence, that, for the first time beat an incredibly proficient human at an incredibly complicated game, was based on a strategy that pretty directly reflects how the human brain operates. It reflects how the human brain learns new things at one of its most basic levels. Okay, so I'm going to exercise a little bit of self-control, believe it or not. I'm not going to go into the other things that DeepMind accomplished in those earlier days, like a version of AlphaGo, basically, the version of AlphaGo, I think they called it something else, that's like incredibly superior to the version that beat the Go master 4 of 5 times, right? This new model of AlphaGo, I think they call it like AlphaGo 2 or something like that, is like orders of magnitude superior to the one that beat Lee Sedol. Or this somewhat unrelated, goal of creating a program that could literally construct a 3D environment that you could virtually navigate just from training it with a combination of a few 2D pictures, which is mind-blowing. Okay, so I'm not focused on AlphaGo today, believe it or not, as much as I'd like to dwell on it. But I think it's useful to have a sense of how they designed that initial landmark program, and it's, I think, a bit more intuitive than what we're going to talk about in just a sec. And I call it a program. I mean, people can also call it an artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it. To develop, I think it's helpful to develop a sense of how this latest achievement came to pass. And it's this latest achievement that I want to go on to next. So DeepMind, again, the company that created AlphaGo, developed a program called AlphaFold. They're really into the alphas. I'm sensing a theme in their naming scheme. But anyways, one of the central challenges in biochemistry, genetics, really all of biology, including neuroscience, is being able to predict the 3D shape of a specific protein from the genetic sequences that encode it. And, I've already gotten painfully far into the weeds, but at the heart of this challenge is being able to predict the shape of a protein, right? The 3D product of some genes, from some sequence of the genes, right? There's a whole other conversation about just what all of those 3 billion base pairs of nucleotides in the human genome actually encode, because it's much, much more than just protein. But, while we have the code that to make a human, right, the current project is to understand what it is that all those A, T, C's, and G's actually functionally produce. And so I'm going to put this picture up for a second, but rest assured it's not important to digest the specifics here. The central point is that, there's a sequence of molecules in our genome that then eventually become a sequence of bigger molecules, and it's those bigger molecules, amino acids, that form proteins. And they form those proteins by being folded in all kinds of different combinations, right? The shapes of those proteins is determined by the specific sequence of components of amino acids. And, you can have a protein that's shaped like a triangle, but if you change a few little components, a couple of those molecules, you can get a square. If you, change some of the other ones, you could get a hexagon, the bestagon. So we know that the relationship between genes and that ultimately become, the components of proteins are pretty predictable. What we don't know is how those gene products ultimately become 3D structures, of proteins. So in other words, it would be super useful if we could predict the shape of a protein that any given sequence, genetic sequence might encode. Because if we could, then we might be able to, have a significantly deeper understanding of genetics, understanding the relationship between a gene and the thing it encodes, whatever it may be, or maybe things that we can just conjure. And so AlphaFold, DeepMind's new program, beat about 100 other groups who were focused on doing a major part of that. Specifically predicting the shape of a protein based off of that final step in the process of making a protein, from genes. And so this is a competition that happens every few years, evidently, I think every 2 years, called CASP. So it's an acronym for Critical Assessment of Structure Prediction. And the goal is to, predict a protein's 3D shape from an amino acid sequence. And the competition between, it's a competition between different groups of scientists that takes place, over the course of several months. And again, it's every couple of years. So the groups who participate in the contest are just given sequences of the building blocks of proteins, and the goal is to predict the 3D model or the 3D structures of those proteins. This particular competition is a bit more complicated than that, but basically the judges were able to assess the accuracies of the group's predictions. And AlphaFold turned out to be accurate at a level that was absolutely unprecedented. And so one of the cool things about this contest was that all of the groups participating did quite well, better than they have in the past. On a 100-point scale of accuracy, with 0 being complete failure, the other team scored somewhere around 75, which is pretty good. However, AlphaFold scored around 90. So a pretty excellent performance. And just to give you an example of what those predictions can look like, here you can see, one of those painfully inscrutable depictions of what a teeny tiny protein looks like. They're called ribbon models or ribbon structures. Or I think Richardson structures is another word. Who cares? In green, you're seeing what the products of laborious experiments that are conducted to discover the shape of a protein produced, and they take quite a long time. Some people spend their entire PhD just doing that. But then in blue, you're seeing the AlphaFold predictions, and the point they're making here is that they're almost completely congruent. Suggesting that there's quite a bit of agreement between the, artificial intelligence approach, and the tried and true, newly old school experimental approach. So, people who are much more competent than I would be, better to dive into the details of how they designed the successful programming strategy, what was different about it this year relative to last, or this competition relative to last competition. Because evidently they explored a couple different strategies, but ultimately they achieved something quite remarkable. And so evidently AlphaFold's predictions didn't match up to NMR spectroscopy, and so I imagine this will be scrutinized a bit more moving forward, but the potential power of this system is pretty immense, right? At a minimum, this application of DeepMind strategy, again, a similar strategy that they deployed to develop an artificial intelligence system that could defeat a Go master, at least a decade earlier than was anticipated, by the way, by most researchers and computer scientists. Maybe that similar system might help to expedite the work of scientists, work, by the way, that's just lasts for years and years. And so please forgive me for horribly mispronouncing this name, but Muhammad al-Quraishi, I believe is how you'd pronounce it, a computational biologist at Columbia University, evidently said, quote, "I think it's fair to say this will be very disruptive to the protein structure prediction field. I suspect many will leave the field as the core problem has arguably been solved. It's a breakthrough of the first order, certainly one of the most significant scientific results of my lifetime." End quote. So what does this mean for you? Like, why should you really care about this beyond it just being cool, artificial intelligence? Well, first of all, this is an example of an artificial intelligence system surpassing human capabilities, right? To be clear, it was just fed a bunch of information that was provided by humans, just like those hundreds of Go matches that were, provided to AlphaGo. And, I suspect it'll need to continue to be assessed with, subsequent amino acid or building block sequences. But, that's a pretty big deal. Certainly, like, within the biomedical sciences, but, like, given the difficulty of this field, it suggests that, like, quite a bit of what humans, do can be reproduced by a computer program that's just based on those simple, fundamental, foundational components. Learning from input information and then error correcting from attempts and failure, right? But less pessimistically, perhaps, it suggests that we, less pessimistically in terms of my career security, but it suggests that, we might be able to, hit the gas pedal towards figuring out, ways to understand the basic biological causes of a bunch of diseases and disorders that have been, vexing for generations. And beyond that, it'll absolutely put the pedal to the metal when it comes to connecting, our sequences of the human genome to the various things that it encodes. And, I have to imagine they'll be working on an equivalent for transcribed RNA. And, if we get to the point where we can predict 3D conformations of DNA, the RNA to which it's transcribed, and then the proteins that result from the amino acids to which that RNA is translated, we'll be, like, far more rapidly approaching a completed understanding of human genetics. And so, there's a whole bunch of other topics that are relevant to this effort, like, the role that, like, non-coding protein genes play. Non-protein coding genes. The roles that those components of the genome play. But suffice it to say that this looks like a landmark achievement in biomedical science. And I think it's worth appreciating that it's very likely that this protein predicting powerhouse was based on, the same exact circuits that are active in your brain at this very second, that were sculpted by hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years of evolution. And so that's pretty much what I have for you. So, if anybody's still with me at this point, thanks for enduring the dopamine explanation. But honestly, like, I encountered a ton of biomedical scientists who, like, still understood dopamine as being the reward neurotransmitter, and it's just not. And now dopamine is simply not the reward neurotransmitter. Rather, it's central to your experience of disappointment and therefore error correction. All right, that's what I got. I'm all done. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you haven't, I would appreciate, if you would subscribe. Great to watch you live. Yeah, please smash that like button. Yes, thank you so much, Cosmic Rose. Surprise. Yeah, hey, what's up, Joy? Good to see you. That baby has a lot she wants to tell us about AI. Yeah, no kidding. She has a lot that she wants to tell us about pretty much everything. All right, why don't we? It's been indicated to me that there are some issues with the live streaming app, so we'll give it a shot and see what happens. Oh, I also wanted to try. Let's see. Okay. If I meant to do this first, cannot recommend. Oh. Huh. Weird. Okay. Huh. Alright, whatever. It's not worth it. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And I studied addiction and anxiety and mood. And that was a big part of what I talked about today on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, where we talked about a landmark achievement in artificial intelligence, where a system was devised by a company with a very interesting backstory, DeepMind, that was able to correctly, or more correctly, correct at an unprecedented rate, let's say, predict the shapes, the 3D structures of proteins based purely off of sequences provided to them, sequences of amino acids, the code, the building blocks of protein. And it's a huge achievement. So, so you can check that out, youtube.com/anthropoid. I also get back, I go, it's a little bit meandery, so, stick with me through it, but you'll learn the reality of what dopamine really does, not like the thing that everybody, sort of pretends like it does or thinks that it does, which is, it is not the reward neurotransmitter. It's incorrect. So you can go check that out, youtube.com/anthropoid. Oh, the link is in my profile on the app, on this app, on Periscope. So, go check it out. Let me know what you think, and subscribe if you find it intriguing. There was also, what was the other thing? Oh no! Hey everybody! Oh, thank you so much for the super hearts, Mimi. Elizabeth. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, Ian. How's your day been? It's been, okay. I stayed up a little bit too late last night, so I'm a little exhausted. But hello and fingers crossed. Good day, Ian. Oh yeah, how's your day? Yeah, let's read that several times. What was the other thing? Gosh. Here, let's just do it this way. It's my daughter. She's such a goofball. We'll do this. Javier. Oh, Javier is my name. Yeah, it's called Socializing and Avoiding Lonely Times. Oh, here we go. Question. Is it true that there is an invention that can stop OCD in its tracks, a brain implant or something like that? Yeah, I mean, I don't know that just socializing would be enough to attenuate the symptoms of OCD. So for anybody that's unfamiliar, OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's an interesting psychiatric condition because it is associated with mood. It is sort of thought to be an anxiety-associated condition. That's sort of how it's conceived, but it has this very unique behavioral component to it, which is the engagement of, it can be tics, it can be routines, it can be rituals. Basically, your understanding of it might be, people who feel compelled to turn a light switch on and off a specific number of times before entering or exiting a room, or excessive washing of hands, which I have to imagine has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. But, it takes a bunch of different forms. But it is thought that, at least in part, it results from a sort of subconscious drive to contain or mitigate levels of anxiety. And I find it really fascinating, not only because it's this really interesting direct relationship between like behavioral output, motor action, and mood, but also that like oftentimes, I've had several friends with OCD, they'll say like, I know that what I'm doing right now is irrational. Like I'm totally aware of this, but I do it anyways, and I'm going to continue doing it. And so, one of the interesting models of OCD that I've seen, and then we can get to a potential treatment, is that part of like there are many things that you could do right now. Like you could, raise your hand, right? Or you could, itch your chin, or, whatever, go get something to drink. But you're not doing those things, but they're available to you. And so part of how, motor action is encoded is basically by inhibiting. It's not like activate the go get a drink path, right? It's not quite that simple. It's actually more like all of those motor actions. That's a little bit more complicated. Instead of go get a drink, think of me just like holding this pen, right? I could have held something else. I could have held whatever, my headphones, or, this Aquaphor or something. These options were available to me. This very simple motor action. But my brain inhibited all of those things in favor of the one that won, which was, me holding up the pen. And the part of the brain, or at least an important part of the brain that executes that inhibition, is called the striatum, or the striatum, and particularly the dorsal striatum. And so the dorsal striatum is dorsal to another part of the striatum called the nucleus accumbens, or the ventral striatum. And that part of the brain is most like directly associated with reward prediction, technically. In fact, I just talked about this circuit on YouTube. but it receives a lot of the dopamine that occurs when people have a drink, or, drink alcohol, or they smoke a cigarette, or do any kind of, particularly like cocaine or amphetamine, really cranks up those dopamine levels. But so does heroin in the nucleus accumbens. And so these are structures that are very tightly associated, and and frankly, it's part of the reason for why I think mood is this underrated behavioral rudder, that we engage in all these behaviors. The only reason we have mood is because we move, is because to determine the optimal behaviors to execute. So all this to say that OCD, one way to think about it is that mechanism of associating specific action with an emotion is just, it's aberrant. I mean, it's not like severely pathological, but it's aberrant, right? It makes no sense that you would turn the light on and off several times because you're worried about some impending doom, that you're trying to protect your mother from crashing in an airplane or something like that, right? It's like overtly irrational, but that association, that mood association with a given behavior, is like sort of at the heart of this. So Javier has been sharing a lot here. So sometimes I wonder whether I have severe OCD, but I see how malleable it is, though difficult to shape as much as I'd like. Mine is heavily tied to disgust and guilt. Right. Yeah. Interesting. So these are different emotional, circuits within the brain. Disgust and guilt, definitely. Like, if you were to ask 100 neuroscientists, what part of Javier's brain do you think is behaving in a unique way to promote OCD? They would say the insular cortex. The insular cortex is like easily one of the most central parts of the brain that drives like a huge amount of human emotion and behavior. Disgust is like one of the central motivators of your conscious experience. It's central to your political affiliations, your political traits, more so, not necessarily your affiliations, but your traits, like what you think is critical for government to do and for government to not do. So anyways, that totally makes sense. It's these powerful emotional experiences that become associated with these behaviors, whether it's washing hands excessively or, manipulating a switch in specific ways, that seems to be unique, right, in the brain of somebody with OCD. Sometimes I wonder whether to reason my way out of it, whether to simply feel the anxiety and not play into the compulsion anyway. Do you think that someone who does more deep thinking is more likely to develop OCD? Well, for sure, like, depending on how you want to define, deep thinking, right? What we know is that high intelligence scores on the tools that we have available to measure intelligence, like the IQ test, tend to be enriched among people with psychiatric illnesses in general, anxiety-associated conditions in particular. So yeah, I mean, totally. That could be a part of it, but and so like OCD is also associated with rumination, just going over and over this source of guilt or this source of remorse, and just being unable to escape it, right? That's another sort of hallmark symptom of OCD. But anyway, so let's get to treatment. So like when it comes to OCD, is going to be extremely complicated, like as complicated as depression is, which is very, very complicated. OCD is going to involve this whole motor component to it, more so than something like depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And so you're not going to be able to just, like for severe depression, there are cases of people being implanted with deep brain stimulation, being implanted with electrodes that enable the stimulation of certain parts of the brain. This is also true for severe addiction. It's not very common, but actually specifically targeting that nucleus accumbens area, that dopamine-receptive part of the brain that's ventral to the part of the brain that I highlighted with regards to OCD. But so OCD is going to involve mood, it's going to involve motor action, cognition. It's just going to be more complicated. So like something like that, I think, would be, let's just say, extraordinarily ambitious, prohibitively ambitious, to try and treat with like a physical intervention. So because OCD is such a complex condition, you have to sort of engage so many parts of the brain at the same time, and so that's why you have like exposure therapy, psychotherapy, and then also pharmacological treatments to mitigate that anxiety, to mitigate that negative emotional affect. And so that's why a lot of the treatments for OCD are similar to the treatments for a lot of the pharmacological treatments for OCD are similar to those for depression or for anxiety. And you can even sometimes, atypical antipsychotics can be used sometimes just to mitigate, just to control, to rein in that like negative emotional, that negative affect. But there could be, like, I could imagine, like, if I had infinite resources and a lab with infinite resources, here's one experiment that I would conduct. So, we know the dorsal striatum kind of does regularly come up in OCD literature, and the striatum in general is a fairly large part of the brain. It's towards the front of the brain. Hey, from Cherry Hill. Hi, from Philly, just over the river and through the woods. Cherry Hill is in New Jersey, everybody. But anyways, the striatum, it's sort of towards the front of the brain, and it's one of the main dopamine centers of the brain, and it is composed of unique receptors, like every part of the brain. And so I would find it interesting to see, and there are animal models of OCD, and so I would imagine that there might be an opportunity to more selectively engage those dorsal striatal neurons by targeting the receptors that are unique to the dorsal striatum, or at least unique to the striatum. But I imagine that just because of how closely associated OCD is with, or emotion is with movement, it'll be extraordinarily difficult to develop a more targeted treatment specifically tailored for OCD. Wow. Okay. What happened to the VA tech QB last night? Looks like he had a seizure. Oh, I didn't see that. Jeez. That sounds scary. Does LSD have the mind unblocking abilities many claim it has? Amor. It's an interesting topic. LSD is one of my favorite topics. Psychedelics in general. So LSD, for anybody that's not familiar, you might have heard of LSD. You might have heard of acid. It is a psychedelic hallucinogen in the same family as psilocybin and magic mushrooms, mescaline, and cactuses. Evidently, cacti is not the correct term. And so on, right? These sort of famous drugs that are most closely associated with the hippie generation, they do seem to be having a bit of a resurgence. And there's definitely been a huge proliferation of agents, drugs that have similar pharmacologies. If you're interested in that, check out Alexander Shulgin. Just check it out. He's like a wizard. But anyways, so LSD, yeah, and so you're right. Like LSD, also DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is sometimes also kind of portrayed as like opening the third eye and doing all these kinds of metaphysical things. So for me, so as a neuroscientist, as a neuropharmacologist at heart, I think of drugs as tools to perturb the way the brain is operating, specific parts of the brain, temporarily. So rather than like seeing what happens when you lesion this part of the brain, you're like, oh, I lesioned this part of the brain and you go blind. Oh, that part of the brain was probably important to vision, but sorry, you're blind now, right? Rather than that strategy, which kind of was the strategy in like the nascent form of neuroscience for a very long time. But once we realized, these drugs, the brain is doing something. It's not just like a temperature regulator, which is what like Descartes, I think, thought it was, or maybe Francis Bacon. It's doing something. And so, and there are all these, these drugs evidently you need a brain, and you need to have, or I guess not necessarily, to have a psychoactive drug, you need a brain, right? And specific parts of the brain have differences. And so, so for me, like, I think of these drugs as just tools to temporarily see what happens when you kind of, turn the knobs a little bit in parts of the brain that would never happen, naturally. And then you can see. And so for me, like, when people say like it's enlightening or it opens their third eye or unblocks their mind, these types of things, opens their mind to a broader consciousness, what I am hearing when people say that is they are having an experience that is fairly unique to this family of drugs, and so therefore serotonin regulates that experience, that because it's not like there's a part of the brain that is literally like, or a circuit in the brain that's devoted to like profundity detection, like how important is this experience, is it equivalent to like the way I brush my teeth every day, right? I can't tell you what I was thinking about when I was brushing my teeth this morning, but like just because none of it was particularly profound, but I can certainly retell like when I visited the El Yunque, rainforest in Puerto Rico, or, when I went into like the caves of, I think in Arizona. So clearly not that important to me, but, or, when I proposed to my now wife, or when we got married in this like guerrilla style marriage in front of Independence Hall here in Philly. I don't know if that's legal, but it happened. So, whatever. That was a profound experience. And so that's an emotional experience. And it's like, it is a sense almost, right? That there is like a part of the brain that's devoted to, this is important, this is not so important. So remember this, don't worry about that so much. And we know that various drugs manipulate that specific part of the brain. Notoriously cannabis. So cannabis is sort of like classically associated with like, whoa, whoa, you're blowing my mind, dude. And that's because the cannabinoid signaling system in part regulates that process of profundity detection. How important is this experience? How important is this information? And so for me, when I hear, LSD and DMT described as opening your mind, opening your third eye, all these kinds of things, I hear serotonin regulates that sensation, that process. And so, is there anything magical about LSD or DMT that make it somehow associated with more profound experiences than, say, alcohol or cocaine? I don't think so. What I think it's a combination of, people don't regularly consume those substances. So the altered state is a unique altered state, right? It's not, alcohol, it's always the same, right? It's, reliable. It'll do the same thing every time. And so, how could you possibly have these like particularly unique experiences that you don't just associate with that specific unique experience, rather than like, oh, it's the alcohol that provided that epiphany or that, that profound experience. So I think it's just that people use them more sparingly. So it's inevitably going to be, the thoughts you have are going to be more unique, right, than the other drugs that they do, and because that altered state is unique relative to the other drugs, and you use it, people use it less regularly, those thoughts, that cognitive experience is more unique. And so therefore, you have, you perceive these realizations or these experiences to be more profound. Another thing, though, is, empathy, social empathy, is also obviously regulated in the brain, and it's sensitive to intervention by drugs. Like MDMA notoriously influences literal like outward expressions of empathy. People become more empathetic, in other words, and these drugs do that too. And so I think a combination of all these things, plus they elevate mood for the most part, not like cocaine or anything, but they elevate mood. Combination of increased empathy and social sort of drive, all combine to feel very metaphysically significant and profound. But it's not because you're like connecting with the machine elves or having some metaphysical experience. It's just you're having a very unique experience, and that's worthy of being remembered. So, yeah, sorry. It's something about which I think kind of regularly, or I have thought kind of regularly, just because, like, you're right, people say that about these drugs all the time. So like, what is it that's unique about them that sort of that association has made that association stand the test of time? It's an interesting topic. Aldous Huxley stopped using mescaline in favor of lysergic acid diethylamide, I presume. Why? But I don't know. I mean, perhaps he just enjoyed it more. That would be my suspicion. But people like different. So another example of that, of like somebody making like an intentional choice of one hallucinogen over the other, is Timothy Leary was like probably the most famous drug user, or certainly psychedelics user in the world. A brilliant guy. The fundamental idea that he was pursuing early on is kind of sound. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's correct, but it's like basically his argument, one of his arguments, was that if we can just modify the neurochemistry of people who are violent, then we can reduce their predispositions to violent behavior, right? So in other words, if we medicate these people in the correct way, we can stop violence, right? It's a very hippies sort of 60s kind of thought. But just unfortunately, like, he was working with the wrong drugs, you know, and he started drinking literally his own Kool-Aid. The classic example is John C. Lilly, the guy who invented the sensory deprivation tank, this really strange guy who worked at Penn, or University of Pennsylvania, where I went to grad school for a while. Very brilliant guy. He just went down this rabbit hole, and like Timothy Leary, literally, evidently, tried to convince John Lilly to stop doing so much ketamine. Ketamine was John Lilly's drug of choice. And he was like, that stuff is so boring, dude. Like, try this LSD. It's going to change the world. And he was just like, nope, no thanks. All right. Will you do something guided for me? What do you mean, guided? I have epilepsy, and I'm a sociopath. Would you do guided DMT with me? Oh, no, I don't think I would be the right person. There are clinical trials going on right now of not DMT, but psilocybin, very, very chemically quite similar. It's just the addition of a phosphate group at the 4 position of tryptamine, of dimethyltryptamine. I mean, there are clinical trials evaluating the use of those drugs for the treatment of depression and psychiatric conditions in general. You know, go on clinicaltrials.gov and type in psilocybin or type in dimethyltryptamine and see if anything strikes your fancy, because they're out there. I mean, you know, people are doing this work. Mates, I have a mental illness. I have voices inside my head. Oh, mate, I have a mental illness. I have voices inside my head. Well, I mean, if that's the case, well, so first of all, in terms of hallucinations, you know, like the hallucinations that you're having, hearing voices, that is the more common form of hallucination during like psychosis or in schizophrenia. Far more common than visual hallucinations, which is kind of interesting to me. But so you know, that sounds like you would really benefit from consulting with a psychiatrist. You know, somebody who has experience helping people who are, you know, who have had those types of, you know, hallucinations. Do you have to have hats specifically made? No. I would like to, though. I don't really wear hats very much. Was his supposition correct? Okay. How much longer will the Earth survive? I'm not sure. I think at least until I'm done with it. A pretty long time. The Earth will continue to exist. Whether or not it's going to exist in this form, it's an entirely different question. Sensory deprivation tanks are incredible. Yeah, Rob from Hookville. Yeah, I've tried them 2 times, and at this place here in Philly. Very strange, very, very strange experience. The reason I did it twice is the first time I ingested too much caffeine, which I highly discourage if you're going to do sensory deprivation tank, because it's just impossible to sort of drift a little bit, which you kind of need to do to really, you know, derive much interest or benefit from these things. So the second time, I was like far more kind of like ripe, and it is wild, you know. And I can imagine that people who have psychiatric illnesses, mood-related conditions in particular, like anxiety disorders, they might not like it very much. Like it might be a little bit unnerving. Unnerving, yeah, weird. So you know, it's worth evaluating that. If you'd be terrified. Yeah. You know what's cool about sensory deprivation tanks, and like, you know, generally speaking, like they don't truly deprive you of your sensory inputs, but they do diminish them quite a bit. What's interesting is that because you're no longer anchored by your sensory inputs, like you're no longer seeing things, you're no longer hearing things or hearing very much, your sense of your tactile sense, your sense of touch is really diminished, because you're in like the very controlled water temperature, and the salinity of the water is quite high, so you just float. So you're quite deprived of sensory inputs, but not entirely. Evidently, if you go into a room that is like the quietest possible room, where any sound is so diminished because of like the architecture of the room, because of all the stuff, the weird angles that they have on the wall that catch sound waves, you'll begin to hallucinate. Like you'll begin to experience auditory hallucinations. How TF do memories work? Man, that is a hell of a question. Not gonna lie. There are entire labs that are devoted to, many labs, that are devoted to not only like how does memory work, but how does a specific kind of memory work, and here's why. There's many forms of memory. It's not like a hard drive where you can store pretty much whatever kind of computer-based information you want. It doesn't matter. The hard drive is agnostic. It'll just accept text files. It'll accept videos. Who cares? That's not how the brain works. The brain doesn't really have a hard drive. Rather, what it has is a system to sort of store compressed forms of experiences. That's just one that's called episodic memory. But there are other kinds of memory. There's a kind of memory, my favorite, that I always like to talk about is procedural memory. This is a form of memory that you barely know that you have. It's the form of memory that kicks in when you get back on a bike after 10 years of not riding a bike. You get a little shaky, but the memory is there, that procedural memory. But you utilize procedural memory way more frequently than you think you do. Every time you drive a car, you're executing procedural memory. Even things that you don't know that you know. Like here's my favorite demonstration for this is, everybody put your hands at 10 and 2 or 11 and 2. I don't really know what the numbers are. I think they've changed now. On a steering wheel. Put your hands on a steering wheel. And then change lanes. Go through the motion of changing lanes. I did this with a class of a bunch of undergrads, and here's what they all did. They were like, they all focused on things that had nothing to do with changing lanes, or that had nothing to do with the actual example, where they would look over their side, or adjust the thingamabob, the rear view mirror. They would hit the indicator, which is good, and then they would just do this, which actually would cause your car to just go diagonal. Like it would just send you off out of your lane, crashing into sidewalks, hitting people, being a disaster. But you never do that, or at least most of you probably have never done that. But you have changed lanes. So here's what you actually do when you change lanes. After doing all the indicator stuff, you go boop, and then you go equidistant to the other side, and then back to the center. That's how you can stay moving in the same direction, but in a different lane. And you all know that, but you didn't. Many of you probably do. Many of you may know that you know that, but most people have no idea that they know that. They just change lanes, and they don't even think about it. That's procedural memory. That's my favorite. But that kind of memory is stored differently than that motor memory, that sense of body and space memory is stored differently than like declarative memory or episodic memory. Declarative memory, like things like, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, right? Declarative fact. I think a year after the New Jersey Constitution came about. Kind of interesting, right? I think a year after, I think. But anyways, little factoid. But anyways, these are different forms of memory. Okay, so there's that. Another, at the most fundamental level, if you wanted like a elevator pitch version of this, of how memory works, everybody calm down. Memory works because the brain is capable of changing, because we have 86 billion neurons, give or take a billion here or there, but who's counting? We have 86 billion neurons, and we have hundreds of quadrillions of synaptic connections between them. And these different neurons have different properties. They do different things, but importantly, they can form new connections with neurons that they'd never interacted with, and they can get rid of old ones that aren't being used. And that's constantly happening. It's happening right now. It happened quite a bit more when you were younger, which is part of the reason for why young people can learn languages like that, and old people like me can't. But that's at the foundation. But then, you might call that neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity at that level, at the synaptogenesis level, but then also at the single cell level, where new receptors are put into a synapse that weren't there before. They get rid of receptors that need not be there, or are just determined to not be unnecessary. All of these processes, these dynamic processes, are at the heart of why we can learn, why we have memory. Okay. Woo! Sorry. Gosh, I'm just kind of bad at doing this on the fly. Okay, that's not bad. All right. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with me there. You can naturally reset your body within 7 days of going into the woods and getting into natural light. I'm not sure what you mean by that. You're not from Philly. Yes, I'm not originally from Philly, but I live in Philadelphia. Yes. excuse me. I've helped build most of those high rises behind you, trying to figure out where you are. Oh, good. I'm in Logan Square. Cool. That's awesome. I like most of them. I don't love the one of the Comcast ones. It just looks weird. But okay. Let's see. I taxi jet aircraft for an airline. I get it. Oh, I see. Like you drive airplanes around. That's pretty cool. Would you say the brain has corrupted JPEGs more so than raw files? Yes, that's not bad. Actually, that is like a really good heuristic. So, and here's why. So for anybody that doesn't know what T-Bones is talking about, so JPEG is an image format that is a compressed file. But basically, it's like if you were to take a picture with a camera, there's a ton of information there. Another thing that like being in neuroscience has done to me is that when I look at a picture, what I think about is the data that picture has. And so, when you take a picture, there's a ton of information that enables you, like, let's say, not even a raw file, but like a TIFF or something, that all that information is there to enable you to stretch the image bigger, to make it smaller, to change the color tones, to do all kinds of things to it without losing data. But the problem is that these files are so big. And so for things like the internet, or for most things, if you could just get rid of all that extra information, you have the image you want. It's the right size, it's the right color. That's all you need. You're not going to change it. So then you just get rid of all that extra superfluous information, and you have a much smaller file size, a couple kilobytes, and it's a JPEG. But the problem is that you can't manipulate it. And every time you do that, every time it's like re-uploaded and stuff, it loses more and more information. And so eventually you get to this really grainy garbage picture. But the reason I like that example is that every time you have a memory, and it's a compressed form of that experience, right? It's not a perfect recapitulation of that experience, right? We all know this. But what's cool about memory, or what's unfortunate about memory perhaps, is that every time you recall a memory, it becomes vulnerable, it becomes malleable, and it's subject to change. And so right now I'm wearing a black sweater. If you remember this conversation 4 weeks from now or whatever, you might think I was wearing a green sweater, or you could swear that I was actually wearing a collared shirt, right? So in like every time you remember that, these details become grainy, right? They become pixelated. And so just like every time you upload a diploma. Who still hangs diplomas? Did I just say diploma? People do. At my office, I don't hang mine because I didn't want to put a hole in the wall, but I lean it. And other people in their offices do. It's so people understand when they come into your office. Not that happens very frequently. I haven't been in the office in weeks. They can see, oh, he has a PhD. He's not he doesn't have a law degree, which is common in where I work. But this way we don't see the diploma you put up on your wall. I see. The salt effector soothe your nerves. Wait. Dr. Barbara Oakley researches this. Oh, cool. Hello, Nini or Nina, or Nene Cujo. All right. Is the parietal lobe the sole drive of mankind? No. The parietal lobe is a very large lobe, for anybody that's unfamiliar. It's sort of like if you were to look at, the brain as a boxing glove or a fist. It's sort of like right here, this area, this knuckle. Well, it's way oversaturated, but it's the knuckle. And it contains a lot of your sensory processes, your sensory motor cortices, these types of things. Also, it's sort of associated, parts of it are associated with like your sense of body and space, like where your arm is relative to where your body is, right now. And some really crazy things can be done to you with like transcranial magnetic stimulation if you monkey around with the activity in this part of the brain. You can have like all kinds of weird experiences, like feeling as though you're standing behind yourself. Like, what? That's so weird. Anyways, so it's important for all that. But when you say like the sole drive of mankind, I suspect you're suggesting it like there's a part of the brain that is like the seat of consciousness. It's like the substrate of consciousness. Without this part of the brain, we would not be conscious. There's like there's some minimally necessary parts of the brain that are arguably therefore more important than other parts to human consciousness, but there's no such thing as like there's only one like region of the brain that is, you know, the fundamental substrate of consciousness. Rather, it's a collection of circuits interacting with one another. And so, you know, you can make the argument, it wouldn't be absurd to suggest that there is a circuit, like a minimally necessary circuit that is the seat of consciousness, because without it, you could have everything else. You could have a visual system, you could have an auditory system, you can have cognitive systems and stuff, but if you lack this circuit, you will not have a conscious human. It'll be very big. It'll involve structures within the brainstem, because without them, you literally cannot sustain consciousness, and you also cannot communicate with your body. Like the pontine nuclei, the pons, is kind of the reticular activating system. But then obviously there will be higher order systems too. So there's no like one thing, one structure. Cool. Getting a call from, I believe, somebody named Peggy. I might be wrong about this. All right. Last time I took a call, it kind of like screwed up the system. So sometimes if you try calling back in, it looks like we're struggling here. If you try calling back in, it works the second time for some reason. I don't know why. Okay. So what about short-term memory? Okay. Yeah. Interesting topic. So yeah, we were mostly talking about, feel free to call back in. I'll keep an eye on. Mostly what I was just talking about back a couple statements ago, is longer term memory, right? You know, even whether it's declarative memory or episodic memory, you know, ones that last a long time. Short-term memory or working memory, there's sort of slight differences between those terms, but you know, they're basically very, very similar. At least for our purposes, they're the same. This is the kind of memory that, like, you know, you being able to recall what I said, you know, 10 words ago, or like what the last topic of our conversation was. It won't bring up calling in again? What? Seriously? That's irritating. I'm sorry about that. I don't think that there's anything I can do. What if I do that? Let's see. Let's see. That's how my daughter says, let's see. Hey, Scott, no worries. Come on. Don't worry about it. So short-term memory is, again, like your sort of like, you know, ability to recall, you know, something that just happened, essentially. And it is sort of, it's a limited system. You know, people oftentimes will make the argument that they're the comparison to RAM, random access memory. It's not quite the same, though. But anyways, what's interesting about the relationship between short-term memory and long-term memory is that, like, they're physically distinct, well, not entirely distinct, but, like, anatomically, there's an interesting distinction between the regions that, you know, that underlie working in short-term memory versus longer-term memory. Specifically, like, you know, as a memory transitions from being short-term to long-term memory, which is a process, you can, like, there was a beautiful study, I think was published in, in Neuron, where you can see the sort of the signal of that learned memory transition from the hippocampus, from largely, you know, not exclusively, but in part, the hippocampus up to the neocortex. So the human neocortex is quite big relative to essentially any other animal. I think it's the biggest of any animal. Not physically largest, but has the densest with neurons. I think it's like 15 billion neurons versus, like, you know, an elephant has like 265 or something like that, 259 billion neurons in the brain, but they only have like, I think, 5 or 6 billion in their cortex, whereas we have 15 billion, right? And so yeah, so there's like literally a there's like literally a transition of like where the trace of that memory is stored within the brain. So yes, what happens if you get scared half to death twice? Cute. Okay. Let's see. What foods are good for the brain? Well, the problem with like diet and you know, brain health is that there's so much going on within the brain that it's not just like, you know, it's not like it's just making insulin, right? Or it's just pumping blood. It's not like that. It's doing much, much more. It's making neurotransmitters. It's, forming new synapses, getting rid of old ones, forming new neurons in some parts of the brain, even in adults. And so it's, all those processes implicate a ton of different vitamins and minerals and macronutrients, micronutrients, and so on. And so it's not like just eating, make sure you have enough, omega-3 fatty acids, right? It's not that simple. So the best strategy is to pursue a more competent diet broadly and regularly. So, and the one that's most regularly recommended is the Mediterranean diet, or the MIND diet, which is a modified Mediterranean diet, which is basically like, you would be unsurprised. It's like green leafy vegetables, unsaturated fats rather than saturated fats, so like oils instead of butter, lean protein sources, fish, poultry rather than beef and pork and stuff, seeds and nuts, as a snack, and red wine every now and then in the Mediterranean diet, but not the MIND diet. And like the MIND diet also recommends certain sodium intake levels. But basically that, like, you have to have just a competent combination of nutrients rather than like, make sure you have enough, omega-3 fatty acids. The one nutrient that I always bring up, just because the data are supportive that it seems to be unusually healthy when it comes to like a single herb or spice or whatever, is turmeric, and specifically curcumin within that spice, which is most closely associated probably with like curry, like Indian curry. There's been some really remarkable evidence suggesting that it is pretty healthy, like, and it might, reduce the onset of dementia. Maybe there's some evidence that it can. So that would be the one. Just try and add a little bit more curcumin to your diet. Yeah. Whenever my daughter sneezes, my wife says sneezers. This is kind of cute. Oh, whoops. Wait. It's not working. Okay, whatever. Does Prevagen work? I don't know what Prevagen is. That's a supplement, I believe, right? I don't know what it is. So yeah, I can't comment. Oh, it looks like
the scope, of the notes.
Oh.
Where they widen the passages. I forget what it's called.
Yeah.
It didn't seem to have any effect, but I still get this sinus pain on the right side only and down into my ear almost every day in the afternoon.
Oh, at a specific time?
Yeah, towards noon, that sort of thing. And then it'll subside after evening.
Very interesting.
Just trying to get a handle on it, and I just thought I'd throw it out there and wonder if you had any ideas.
Sure. I mean, I the best I can do is sort of speculate here, obviously.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So that procedure didn't reduce the pain is interesting. There is a condition. Is it like quite debilitating, this pain?
It can be. Yeah. It's it just takes your focus away from everything because you're just concentrating on that and just how much it hurts.
Well, so there's a condition called trigeminal neuralgia. Are you familiar with that?
No.
So trigeminal neuralgia is it's sort of a more recently recognized condition where there can just be absolutely searing pain along certain parts of the face or the head, and really, really severe, debilitating, and also the periodicity, like the fact that it's at a similar time for me suggests that there may be some endocrine component to it or immune system component to it, because as the day goes on, just one example, I don't think it would be this one, but it's just one example, is like in men, testosterone is typically at its highest levels right when you wake up, or really right before you wake up. The more sleep you get, and then as the day goes on, it sort of declines. And so that's just one example of like a cycle, an endocrine cycle. And so I could imagine that there might be just inflammatory cycles that are going on. Or it could be, do you drink coffee?
Yes.
Does coffee help?
It doesn't seem to have any effect either way.
Okay. The reason I ask is certain folks who experience migraines or cluster headaches derive some benefit from caffeine. For some people, it like literally cures their migraines.
I see.
That's the only reason I asked. But yeah, so I could imagine there being some kind of endocrine cycle or immune system cycle that happens just as a function of when you went to sleep, when you wake up. One could imagine that that it's so like regional, it's so anatomically specific is kind of intriguing. But yeah, I mean, I might consider, bringing up with your physician, like, hey, what about this trigeminal neuralgia thing? And see what they say. There's definitely a lot of doctors who won't really be familiar with that or won't really think it's like a, it is very difficult to treat. But hey, if nothing's working, then yeah, I mean, I would bring that up.
Yeah, I believe it's called rhinoplasty. They put a balloon up there and then it widens the passages between the sinuses.
Yeah,
so I'm going to go back to the ENT and with my complaints, but I just thought I'd throw it out there because it drives me crazy every day, and it's not sharp pain, but it is debilitating to where I can't focus on anything else. So thanks for taking the time to offer your opinions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how it goes after you talk to them.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, that I've heard some of those stories of trigeminal neuralgia. They're just wild. Actually, my boss got that. I think that same exact procedure that you're talking about, the rhinoplasty. I mean, it just basically means modifying a rhinoceros. And man, like that was a very intense surgery for her. Yeah, and evidently it didn't really help that much either. All right. Will you be taking the COVID vaccine? Well, of course, it depends on which one is available first. Also, I cannot possibly imagine that I would be in a patient category that warrants earlier vaccination. Like, I'm not a frontline worker. I mean, I do work in government, but I'm not like a first responder or anything like that. Frankly, I don't think it would be ethical for me. But once it's available, you better believe I will. Like, this is not a disease you want to get. This is not the flu. It's unpredictable, and it could potentially change your life forever and the lives of people you love forever. Like, it's just not something you want to get. And so, yeah, I mean, it is remarkable how effective these vaccines have been demonstrated to be. I am looking forward to seeing more assessments, bigger assessments of more people, because it's limited people in their samples, and so I always, more data is always better, but yeah, I mean, I think it is a remarkable achievement that these vaccines have come to fruition so rapidly. Also, the Mrna technique is very cool. It actually, in part, was generated by a lab group here at the University of Pennsylvania. And so if they're successful, and evidently their vaccine is like on par, maybe a little bit more effective than the Pfizer vaccine. They're probably kind of similar in terms of efficacy. But if the Mrna technique is effective, that means that we can make a lot more vaccines. Like, we can make a lot more vaccines much more rapidly and efficiently. So, all right. Yes, probably didn't mean a cosmetic nose job. Yeah, I don't think. I can't imagine that it was. Oh, hey, Euro. Good to see you. Yeah, I can't imagine it was rhinoplasty, but hey, I mean, hey, if that's what they told him, that's what they told him. Maybe they did just give him a nose job. They're like, oops, wrong procedure. Oh well, good luck. Okay, nasal ablation is probably the surgery he's talking about. I'm getting that. Wow, septoplasty. Oh, do you have like a deviated septum? Oof. Gosh, sorry to hear it, Scott. But good luck. Yeah. Let's see. Series horn. Oh, septoplasty is moving the septum. Yeah, I'm getting one. Okay, cool. Simply the best. Remember when kicked COVID's ass in 3 days? Well, some people react that way. And I mean, he also, was exposed to that like antibody cocktail treatment that was, what was it called? Like Remagen or something like that. But I don't believe that was shown to be particularly effective. I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, he received the best possible treatment you can possibly get. Any Homo sapien could ever get. Like, you do not have access to those kinds of physicians unless you're quite lucky, or unless you're a physician. So, again, it's like Regeneron. Thank you. Yeah. So, I wouldn't base too much of my strategy on how the most fortunate people in society respond to COVID. Rumpelstiltskin. Yeah, that's what it was. Oh, cool. Oh, Claudio. Hopefully we connect. That would be nice. Not bloody at all. Oh, so there we go. Claudio in Brazil. What's up? How's it going? What's on your mind?
Hi, Ian. Hello. Thanks for having me as a guest.
My pleasure, as always.
I have a question about some episodes I noticed with my sense of hearing. It happens often that I'm concentrated reading, let's say, reading a blog or an email, and the phone either rings or more likely like just beeps for a notification, like a WhatsApp notification or something. And then I immediately, look it up, dismiss whatever it is, and go back to my reading. And after a few seconds, like 10, 15, 20 seconds, I don't know, something less than a minute, but certainly less than a minute, but a few seconds, my awareness of it is like I get a second ring. I mean, I hear a second ring, even though it's not physical. So I kind of start questioning whether the phone rang again. I mean, I don't actually physically hear it, but my memory acts as if there was another ring, and I'm like, okay, did it beep again? Did it sound again? Then I go and check it again, and invariably, no, there was no second sound. So it's as if like there are 2 channels for the noise to come to my awareness. One that is most immediate, that to where my alertness just respond and look quickly and then back, and then another one that seeps into my my flow of consciousness a little later. I don't know if I'm clear.
No. I totally get it. Yeah. That's super interesting. I don't think I've experienced that. I've experienced something kind of similar though, where my phone will vibrate in my pocket. And whatever, it vibrates, it does, you get messages and stuff. But then if I've been like interacting with my phone quite a bit over the course of the day, I'll sometimes feel phantom vibrations, like it didn't actually vibrate, and I'm like, it's sort of disconcerting. But anyways, I mean, I cannot tell you exactly why that kind of experience might happen, but I have one idea, so we'll go with that.
Okay.
The way sensory systems function is that you can think of it as sort of like lower order and higher order. So the lower order is like literally photoreceptors, or in this case, the auditory system, hair cells, literally vibrating. Like you literally hear the parts of the brain that are responsible for taking in that information. That happens fast. And then that information is transmitted to a dedicated part of the brain to like to just decipher what it is. Like, okay, that is a high-pitched sound. That's it. Like super, super simple. And then ultimately it goes through a longer process of like, okay, that was a high-pitched sound, and that's the one that I chose from my phone. So therefore my phone is ringing, right? But that end part of the process is higher order, and it takes longer. And so I could imagine, there's one. This is partly what explains how it is that people with schizophrenia have hallucinations. At least there's a theory that's why it happens. Is that basically those 2 processes are different systems, anatomically different systems. And the higher order process takes longer. And so for somebody who actually has, schizophrenic hallucinations, and most of those hallucinations are auditory, the theory is that there's something unique about the parts of the brain that are devoted to that first order simple sensory process, and that's what enables them to have hallucinations. Whereas if people have something unique about their higher order parts of the brain, then they can have delusions. And so those are sort of like classic things that happen with schizophrenia. So I'm not suggesting that you have schizophrenia or anything like that, but that I could imagine that every now and then that there is a discordance or there is an understanding of what that sound is early on, but then that's distinct, anatomically distinct from parts of the brain that then are implicated in you understanding that it's your phone, that it's the sound that you chose for this specific message or whatever. And so it's sort of like a boom, it's sort of like a stutter realization, but because they're different parts of the brain, they both happen. It's just one is later than the other. That's what I would imagine that might explain it, but I cannot tell you for sure. I'm sure that's very irritating.
Well, it doesn't happen so often, but yes, it's I wouldn't say irritated. It's more like it makes me think,
yeah,
what's going on.
yeah, no, that's interesting. Thanks for calling in, Claudio. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Claudio in Brazil. Like Susan syndrome. I'm not familiar with Susan syndrome. Huh. I recently realized I have auditory processing disorder, though. Huh, interesting. Oh, you've asked your question twice. Don't make me call in. What? You did? Sorry about that. Let's see. Not bloody at all, but my septum. Oh, what do you think the future of mRNA? What do you think is the future of mRNA in neuroscience? Well, I mean, it certainly has good job security, that's for sure. So for anybody that's unfamiliar, mRNA is a form of our of our genetics. Basically, you have your genome, right? A, T, C's, and G's. First, that genome is what's called transcribed. It's like turned into another very similar form of genetic storage, which is RNA. There's different forms of RNA, mRNA, whatever. So it's sort of like one layer of your genome being expressed, basically. But mRNA can do a lot of really cool stuff that has nothing to do with protein expression. In fact, a lot of it has nothing to do with protein expression. So, for example, mRNA can influence, like physically influence how certain proteins operate, or can physically influence how much a given gene is expressed. It's not encoding for a protein or anything like that. It's just sort of floating around doing that. Just the actual structure of the RNA itself is doing that. There's all kinds of wild things that can happen, like RNA, exosomes. Like you can essentially transmit genetic information from one neuron to another neuron directly. Like rather than activating a gene in another neuron for whatever it might be, rather than doing that, neurons can deploy mRNA, or not can't. I mean, they don't decide to do it. It can happen that RNA can migrate from neuron to neuron. So rather than being a neurotransmitter influence or an electrophysiological influence, it's like a direct genetic influence. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that, and that's the one of the things that RNA will certainly be involved in. One of the domains of research in neuroscience into RNA for sure. Yeah, there's other cool stuff. But yeah, I think it's that like more complicated, less intuitive properties of genetic material in general, but RNA in particular, that will be like a huge boon to understanding not only like how it is that neurons communicate with one another beyond just like the obvious stuff, but also potential treatments. Rumpelstiltskin again. Inner ear nerve hairs are tuned to particular frequencies and excite only certain neurons in the AC. That's right. Auditory cortex is what Euro is describing. That's right. Some sounds I know are unlikely to be real, so so I can ignore them, like gunshots or something. Whoa, really?
That cannot be the first thing that you are bringing up. Are you saying that you have hallucinations? Just arrived. What is being discussed? Low easy days. Whatever you like. I think the phone is set for a second reminder ring. That is totally possible too. That would be very funny. Could depend on being part of that. Yeah. Okay. How to improve memory? Dyslexic. Short-term memory problems. Love to resolve this. So I guess I'm not certain that there would be a connection between dyslexia and any kind of memory problems. But certain, like if you're having consistent short-term memory deficits, like and it's sort of out of nowhere, like you didn't experience that before, you should absolutely just go to your primary care physician and just say that, just bring it up, because it would be important. It could potentially be normal stuff, like you're just getting older and like all of us, your memory begins to not be so great, but it could also be something a little bit less benign. So you would want to just make sure that it's nothing like that. Also, of course, if you are, do any kind of drugs, pretty much every drug except for nicotine, interestingly, is ultimately deleterious to short-term memory. So if you're doing those drugs, you might want to ease up. Nicotine does disrupt memory, but upon withdrawal. So when you try and quit nicotine, one of the it's funny, like this is surprising to I think a lot of people, that one of the most frequent complaints of symptoms of nicotine withdrawal is actually cognitive. It's actually like people feel sluggish and their memory is shot, and it just takes a while to recover. What about caffeine? Oh yeah, that's fair enough. You're right. Well, I guess. Yeah, no, I think that's fair. You're right. I have mild autism. Is there anything that I can do or take to lessen the symptoms? So Shannon, it would depend on what the symptoms of autism are. There are different symptoms of autism. So not that I have to tell you, but just so everybody's on the same page, where there are mood-associated symptoms where oftentimes it can be substantial anxiety and stress, and those can be treated pharmacologically. In fact, that is one of the few things that can actually be medically managed, are the sort of psychiatric components to autism. But when it comes to like the sort of more social stuff of sort of not picking up on social cues, facial expressions, caffeine conversation cues. Clearly, I've had insufficient caffeine. Those kinds of things are much more difficult to. It's not like you can take something to amplify that capability. That's more of like an anatomical thing. But potentially practicing. There are almost certainly people, specialists who are devoted to, improving those skills. If those are the things that you're worried about. All right. New sounds can rewire the auditory cortex. Pretty much everything can be rewired, yeah. Yeah. I don't smoke cigarettes. Oh, okay. I don't smoke, but my memory is short because of concussions. Oh, I take CBD, which helps. Yeah, I've heard that before, Dimitri. But I'm not aware of any evidence that CBD, for anybody that's unfamiliar, that's cannabidiol. It's sort of like it's like the lesser pharmacologically active component of cannabis. Although all of a sudden it's become quite popular. I've never seen any evidence that CBD is clinical evidence that it's helpful for any symptom of like a post-concussive syndrome. But like, yeah. So if somebody's having memory challenges following recurrent concussions, that's more difficult, and it's the kind of thing where, depending on how long ago those concussions were, it could just be a matter of time and you'll just be fine again. But if it's been many years, or many months or many years, there's this weird statistic about concussion recovery, is that the longer it takes to recover from a concussion, the longer it's likely to take. So if it's taking if it was just like a week ago or 2 weeks, that's about normal for things to get back to sort of normal. But if it's been like 6 months, many months, it's more likely to become even longer than that. So it could just be like just a matter of time. But definitely bring that up with your physician. And also, if the concussion just happened, the way that therapy is pursued can be actually quite unintuitive. It's not like, just get back on that horse and practice and stimulate your brain, really do cognitive challenges and stuff like that. In fact, there's evidence that doing that after concussion is actually deleterious. It's actually like what you don't want to do. So does cannabis truly strengthen neural connectivity making for a more efficient human being? Nova's heartbeat. Does it truly do that? Who's making that claim? No, I mean, when you say strengthen connectivity, it will have an effect on how connected different parts of the brain are. In that, it'll alter the connectivity that arises, that would naturally arise. In other words, your brain is changing moment to moment, or not moment to moment, but like day to day, as a function of your daily experiences, the lessons you've learned, the whatever the experiences you've had, and so your brain changes accordingly. Like Euro Maestro bringing up the like neuroplasticity in the auditory cortex as a function of the things to which you've been exposed. Oh, there's an interesting thing about that actually. But anyways, and so your brain will be changing, but if you have the consistent or chronic presence of cannabis, that will influence how that change occurs, the trajectory of that neuroplasticity. And so, yeah, certain things will be strengthened that wouldn't have been strengthened, but that certainly that's not like a beneficial thing. That's just like an inevitable thing of pharmacology. Luckily, I got an MRI and doctor said I don't have CTE. Oh, that's good. That's certainly good. Tell us about psilocybin. All right, so psilocybin is in the same family of pharmacological agents as LSD, lysergic diethylamide, but psilocybin is basically 4-phosphoryl dimethyltryptamine. You might recognize dimethyltryptamine. That is sort of like the spine of psilocybin. Psilocybin just adds a little phosphate group to the 4 position, and that alters its pharmacology. It also enables it to be far easier to consume. And so far easier for it to get into the brain, let's say. It's like essentially all psychedelics is principally a serotonergic drug, meaning that it principally interacts with the serotonin signaling system, and most prominently the 5-HT2A receptor. And because of what the serotonin signaling system does, what it regulates a bunch of things from dreams to mood to sleep, appetite, all these various things. You get this very diverse set of altered states of consciousness, and so yeah. I don't know really. Oh, I've actually talked about psilocybin quite a bit on YouTube. Yes, thank you, Joy, for reminding me. YouTube.com/anthropoid. You can check it out. I talked most recently about potential clinical applications of psilocybin, so you can check that out at youtube.com/anthropoid or on my profile page. But I should probably call it a day. So that's my YouTube channel. Go check it out if you're interested in where did I go for my degrees? I went to the Claremont Colleges for my bachelor, for my undergrad, and the University of Pennsylvania for my PhD. Thank you for asking and reminding me to say it. Anyways, youtube.com/anthropoid. I talked about today. I talked about artificial intelligence and this new feat. I'm sure Euromeister has heard about this, but this feat of computer science of being able to predict the shape, the 3D structure of a protein based off of its sequence of amino acids that comprise it. So that's DeepMind is the company that made it. AlphaFold is the program, but I talked a lot more about basically like the first computer program to ever beat a human at this very complicated board game called Go. And I also talked about the parallels that it has to the human dopamine signaling system, error prediction, error correction. So you can check that out, and you can learn the real function of dopamine. It is not the reward neurotransmitter. Okay, But beyond that, thanks so much for hanging out. Oh, and if you enjoyed what's on YouTube, do me a favor and prod, poke, tickle, scratch the subscription or the subscribe button. I would appreciate it. And thank you very much for the super hearts, Elizabeth. As always, I really appreciate that. And Craig, I believe, thank you so much. Really appreciate your generosity. Otherwise, I hope to see you, at least some of you, next week, same time, same place. I'll be there. Hope you will be too. See you there. Have a great beginning of your week. All right, and so thank you all so much for watching on YouTube. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed today's topic. It was fun to go down memory lane. Like, I hadn't seen those notes, so I took these notes, right, from Demis Hassabis, who's the founder of DeepMind, and it was fun going down memory lane. Like, I remember sitting there at that talk. If you enjoy it, if you enjoyed this conversation or these topics, or you want to suggest some topics, I'm all eyeballs. Go ahead and subscribe. Otherwise, have a great week. See you guys later.